golly, that was the first Dickens I ever read.
Well, I'm glad to say that Naomi Beck stepped to me this afternoon. Thank you for taking me back to Dickens.
We're ready to go. Oh, I'm supposed to say that? I'm supposed to tell them that? I don't think there's any need. Mike wants me to ask you not to block the aisles because of the fire code. I guess that's only one person here. So I've done my task. So I don't want to hear any groans out there. I am not speaking again this evening. You actually, thank you. We actually have a first-rate person coming in for the featured evening lecture. Professor Michael Ruse, the Workmeister Professor of the History and Philosophy of Science at Florida State University. If there's anybody on the program here who probably doesn't need an introduction, it's Michael Ruse. His reputation seems to precede him every place he goes, but I will do what is needless. Michael Ruse is a mongrel. He claims to be Welsh, English, Canadian, and American, and picks his country when it best suits him. He did get most of his education here in Great Britain at the University of Bristol, where he earned both his baccalaureate degree and his PhD. For 35 years, a whole career, he should be retired. He taught at the University of Guelph in Canada, and now he's in his 11th year as a professor at Florida State University, where he is the father of the program in the history and philosophy of science. I'd like to tell you more about his religious beliefs or lack thereof. I do know that he was raised something of a Quaker and now says he is both an atheist and an agnostic. I have no idea what the heck that means. I know he's not a Christian, although he does say that you can be a Christian and a Darwinist at the same time, so that's pretty good. Despite his lack of belief, and I will say this personally, there are few people I would trust more than Michael Ruse. Or if I were in need, there are few people I would go to more quickly. I was about to say, I trust him with anything, and then I thought, well, maybe not my wife and daughter. There are limits. Sorry, Mike. Michael became a superstar in the area of science and religion in the early 1980s when he appeared as an expert witness in the Arkansas trial that was sometimes billed as Scopes 2. Every time there's a major trial, it's a Scopes something. And apparently, no reputable philosopher of science would go down to Little Rock to educate the judge on the boundaries of science. And young Michael, we had to go to Canada to get somebody, and a Brit at that, to come down and educate the American court on what science was. And Michael went in there and he told the judge, he said, look, science is tentative. Well, we know that's wrong. Science is falsifiable, and another criterion is that it's testable. Still trying to get him to explain the difference, because I have no idea what the difference is between falsifiable and testable. It has to be natural. I kind of understand what that means, and he had some fifth criterion that I bet neither one of us could remember this evening. What's important is that his skewed testimony won the case. The judge in Little Rock based his ruling on these criteria and decided that since creation science didn't meet them, it must be religion. I mean, there were other choices. It could have been bad philosophy. But no, he didn't even consider that after listening to Michael. And when the Supreme Court in 86 and 87 reviewed these cases, technically not that one, but another one very similar, they adopted this. He is enshrined in national law as the person who defined what science is in America. I have said, and I believe this, that no philosopher has had more practical impact in America than Michael Ruse. I probably shouldn't say this, but about 10 years later at a meeting of the AAAS, he recanted and admitted that he had been wrong.
Give you a podium and you can't shut up.
Well, let me tell you, that's what happened with Michael at the AAAS. He was so hungover he couldn't shut up, and he admitted it was all wrong. Okay. I move on. He's had a distinguished career. He's published more single-authored books than I've edited. He has given the Gifford lectures, but unlike Peter Harrison, you had to have help, right? You didn't do it all by yourself. He is the founding editor of the journal Philosophy and Biology. Unlike most philosophers of science, he actually takes the history of science seriously and has sometimes written pretty good history of science. I would say the best, most comprehensive book of his that's historical is From Monad to Man. Would you agree? Probably your best one? And I urge you to pick up his latest book on spirituality and science, which has a tear-producing dedication to it. And so much...
I did Twed Larson.
Oh yeah, that would make me cry. Tonight...
Something important.
Very important. You ask Ed. Tonight, he is going to talk to us about might is right. Does Darwin refute? You know, I've never heard this word before tonight. I never heard it. Thrasymachus, who has some connection with Plato, who was some Greek guy. Welcome.
It does sort of put you in your place. First of all, the guy says, you know, you're the most important philosopher of science of the 20th century. And then he turns around and says, who is this Thrasymachus guy? Obviously, you're a real authority on me. Well, in fact, I think my talk dovetails rather nicely with Ron's talk this afternoon. Ron was basically dealing with the historical side, and I'm going to pick up on that. I'll say a few things which I think will sound more contradictory perhaps than they really are. And then I want to sort of push, as it were, given the topic of this weekend, as it were, from the sort of historical stuff about what people have had to say about the evolution of morality into, well, does evolutionary theory help us at all in understanding morality? So that's basically the theme that I'm dealing with. I couldn't resist this picture. Thrasymachus, as you probably know, except Ron doesn't, was one of the characters in Plato's Republic. And he's in the first book, and he's the sophist who says that basically might is right. And I got this. I do want to assure you, this is not a picture of Ron Numbers wrestling on top, wrestling Ed Larson to the ground underneath. Although it does look a little bit that way, doesn't it? As Ron told you this afternoon, a lot of people think that Darwinism equals social Darwinism, equals laissez-faire, equals might is right, equals widows and children to the wall. This was certainly would have come as some considerable surprise to Charles Darwin. Darwin, I think, is very interesting. In The Descent of Man, Darwin deals with both religion and with morality. But if you look at his discussion of religion, which basically is just a riff on David Hume, and we know that because Darwin read Hume's essay on religion very carefully, in a way, one just gets the sense with Darwin that religion doesn't cut much ice with him. He's not that interested in it. He doesn't he knows it's socially important, but intellectually and emotionally, I don't think Darwin finds religion that exciting. And in fact, his attitude towards religion in The Descent of Man is pretty contemptuous. I mean, he likens it to his dog seeing a parasol blowing on a windy day and thinking that there's something. And basically, Darwin says that's what we do when we believe in God. So as I say, one thing I find interesting in The Descent is that by and large, religion gets the back of Darwin's hand. However, morality does not. Darwin is intensely interested in morality. He really, truly, this is something which is of major concern to him, and he discusses it at length in the Descent of Man. And we know that, in fact, these are ideas which go way back to when he was developing his theory of evolution in the 1830s. Now, Darwin's not a philosopher. He reads philosophers. For instance, he's read some Kant. He read the Metaphysics of Morals. He certainly is up on utilitarianism. He's read some Hume. And later on, he reads Sidgwick. I mean, so he really does take philosophy quite seriously. But he's not a philosopher. And in The Descent, he's not offering a philosophical account of religion. More, he's offering a naturalistic account of why religion would come about. And basically, the position that Darwin wants to take is that, not religion, morality. Basically, the position that Darwin wants to take is that morality is something which came through evolution, it came through natural selection, because basically those humans who are moral are going to survive and reproduce better than those that don't. He doesn't talk about these issues at all in the origin. I mean, it's on his mind. It's clear that it's on his mind. But as we know, Darwin's very deliberate strategy was not to raise the human issue in the origin. He wanted to get the basic theory on the table, and only at the end, so that people couldn't accuse him of cowardice, and he didn't want that because he did believe that it applied to humans. Only at the end does he make a very brief reference to humans. But when he comes to The Descent, that he really starts to let rip. And as I say, morality gets a major discussion. And basically, what he wants to say, as I say, is that those humans who are moral are going to survive and reproduce better than those that don't. It must not be forgotten that although a high standard of morality gives but a slight or no advantage to each individual man and his children over other men of the same tribe, yet that an advancement in the standard of morality and an increase in the number of well-endowed men will certainly give an immense advantage to one tribe over another. So it's clear that it's natural selection at work there. Now, this is not the basis of my talk, but I want to add this as a footnote. Most people naturally look at this and say, well, Darwin thinks that natural selection then is working on the group and not the individual, because surely why would morality benefit the individual when everybody else might be cheating? And surely what Darwin is saying then is that natural selection works on the group, and that's the way you would read this. The weasel word here is tribe. In fact, although Darwin doesn't make it clear in The Descent, in a letter that he writes to a son later on when he's reading a passage by Sidgwick, Darwin makes it very clear that he thinks of a tribe as an interrelated group, like a nest of wasps or something like that. So in other words, Darwin doesn't have modern genetics. He doesn't have the ability to think in terms of kin selection and those sorts of things and selfish genes, because he doesn't think about selfish genes because he's not thinking about genes. But if you like, it's a kind of family selection. But it's clear that for Darwin, he's thinking of morality as something which is going to benefit a group of co-related individuals over other groups of the same kind. So as I say, but the point is, he definitely wants to say that it's natural selection. So I think this immediately backs up the sorts of things that Ron was talking about this afternoon. That if you read The Descent of Man, you are not reading an exercise in Jack London, social Darwinism of that kind. There's no question that Darwin thinks that some groups of humans are superior to others, and there's no doubt that the English are superior to everybody. So he's certainly got those sort of Victorian, if you like, prejudices. Some of us don't think they're prejudices, but he's certainly got those. But there's no business about tribes beating each other out and all of that sort of thing. In fact, he makes it very clear that when white people meet native people and white people succeed and natives don't, it's usually because the natives get the whites' diseases and the diseases wipe the natives out. So it's not a question of intelligence or a stronger or anything like that. It's usually something which comes about by disease. But as I say, overall, there's no question that in the descent, Darwin is not talking about these sorts of things. Now, Ron, I think, is absolutely right that Darwin is ignored. People may use the name, and I think sometimes they do use the name, but basically they've got their own views, and to hell with what they are, Darwin. So what I want to do now, having sort of, as it were, this is my little prologue. Now I want to talk then a little bit about what is morality. Then I want to talk, and I'll do it even more briefly than I would have done otherwise because Ron did it this afternoon, a little bit about some of the traditional positions. I prefer not to use the word social Darwinism. I like to call it traditional evolutionary ethics or something along those terms so that we don't have that kind of language barrier. And then I want to go back, as it were, and forward and look at what I think would be the kind of approach that Darwin would kind of like today. In other words, the sort of approach. And then I want to see what Darwin does not offer, and I'm not criticizing because he's not trying to. Can one get some philosophical juice out of this, or is one simply stuck at giving a naturalistic account of the evolution of morality? Okay. Well, what about morality? What is morality? Basically, yeah, it is supposed to be a joke. Don't put this in your notes, okay? Charlton Heston was not God, even though he thought he was, and most Americans still think he was. But what are the questions that one must speak to when one is going to give an analysis of morality, and particularly when one is going to give a philosophical analysis of morality? Now, philosophy 101, if you like, that Sam Harris has certainly not encountered, neither has Richard Dawkins. Basically, what philosophers say is there are two basic questions that any adequate theory of morality must speak to. What should I do? Why should I do what I should do? These are known in the trade as the first kind are normative or substantive questions, normative ethics or substantive ethics. And in the trade, the second kind of questions are about foundations, and that's known as meta-ethics. So to give you an example, and I'm not offering this as right or wrong, but I'm offering this as something which would be a good example, take Christianity. The Christian position is usually said, by the way, every talk of this nature has to introduce a slide of Mother Teresa and another one of Hitler. And I won't let you down on that, okay? So substantive ethics for the Christian is love your neighbor as yourself, or something of that kind. So that would be what you ought to do. And then meta-ethics is, why should I love my neighbor as myself? What is the justification? And many Christians give it all to God. They want to say something along the lines of, well, you should do what you should do because that's what God wants you to do, or something. This is known as the divine command theory. Now, as it happens, another thing Ron does not know, Plato in the Euthyphro criticized this one very, very severely, because does God want us to do that which is good because God wants it, or is it good because... could God make it okay, morally okay, to rape little old ladies on a Friday afternoon? Even worse, could God make it morally okay to mark up your library books and return them late? That's the one thing that all philosophers agree on is morally wrong. That is not culturally relative. But a lot of Christians certainly subscribe to we should do what God wants. As Ron mentioned, I was brought up as a Quaker, and it wasn't easy being a pacifist in the years after the Second World War, but we little Quakers were all told that when push comes to shove, pacifism is right because Jesus said so in the Sermon on the Mount, end of argument. I mean, it was as simple as it was. I'm not saying that this was a good argument, but what I'm saying is that this was a solid Christian argument, if you like. So, but I'm not offering these to commend them to you, but rather to illustrate to you how any adequate moral theory has to answer questions at both levels. All right, now let's turn then to traditional evolutionary ethics. As I say, it's known as social Darwinism, but I prefer not to use the term, and why don't I? Because of all the very good reasons that Ron gave us this afternoon. What does traditional evolutionary ethics have to say about substantive ethics? What does traditional evolutionary ethics have to say about meta-ethics? Well, certainly, whether they call themselves social Darwinians or not, there have been traditional evolutionary ethicists who do want to argue for some kind of might is right and the strong, take all and that sort of thing. And certainly I think that you find it often in the novelists, even more so than in the social scientists or the philosophers or others like that. And certainly this is very much the theme of The Call of the Wild. Incidentally, do you realize that there are something like 30 editions of this book still in print? I mean, it's obviously, a huge number of people read it. I think they must all be Republicans, but there we are. But this would certainly be one example of might is right. But as Ron said, I think you get all sorts of different versions. A lot of people, including people in this room, think that at some level traditional evolutionary ethics, certainly historically, has led to or has justified Hitler. Personally, I think the story is a lot more complex than that. Something had to cause Hitler, and I don't think you can just simply say it wasn't this, and it wasn't that, it wasn't Luther, and it wasn't Wagner, and it wasn't Darwin, and it wasn't Bismarck. I mean, something had to bring it around. So I'm certainly prepared to accept that certain philosophical ideas of this ilk certainly paid in. But my own feeling is, particularly if you read Mein Kampf, you couldn't be farther away from Darwin if you read Mein Kampf. I mean, Darwin is not obsessed with Jews. I mean, he really, truly isn't. I suspect, like most Englishmen of his time, he would have been mildly anti-Semitic. I certainly discovered some letters by Huxley which suggest that he was. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if that, in fact, I'd be surprised if that were not the case. But certainly I don't see the tight connections that certainly a number of people are pushing now that particularly evangelicals, now that ID seems to have crumbled from within. But I think what is interesting, and this is the point I think that Ron was making, and I think that this is what's so important, is that if you call it social Darwinism, call it traditional evolutionary ethics, it covers such a wide spectrum, very much as Christianity does. Very much as Christianity. I mean, what does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? Well, Cardinal Spellman thought it was bombing little yellow men. On the other hand, Quakers thought that it was going and helping them. I mean, you can draw completely contradictory interpretations of certainly Charlton Heston meant that every good Christian should, be packing a gun. You just get completely contradictory positions. And I think that you find that this happens with traditional evolutionary ethics too. Certainly, Peter Kropotkin in Mutual Aid is arguing, he is a group selectionist, he is arguing for groups, but he's certainly arguing that natural selection has brought about a sense of mutual aid and that this is the way that we behave and we should let it happen and we should work together, we don't need other things. Vernon Kellogg, who was mentioned this afternoon, I think he was a Quaker. If he wasn't a Quaker, he was certainly very closely related to them. He thought, for instance, that natural selection led us away from war, certainly before he went to Belgium, and certainly was very much involved in a lot of peace activities and philanthropic activities, as of course was Herbert Hoover. Again, in the name, if not of Darwin, because in fact Kellogg was rather iffy about Darwinism, but certainly in the name of evolution. So as I say, you get completely contradictory positions or varied positions. And I think one of the most interesting is somebody today, because I want to point out that this is not just history. I think the most prominent evolutionary ethicist of our day is Edward O. Wilson, the Harvard entomologist and sociobiologist. And there's no question, if you read his works like Biophilia, he is arguing that we ought to preserve the rainforests. Why? Because humans have evolved in symbiotic relationship with nature, and literally a world made of plastic would be killing. And so, therefore, it is our moral obligation from an evolutionary perspective to promote biodiversity, and in particular to worry and try to save the remaining Brazilian rainforests. I mean, I'm not making this up, folks. It's there in the books that he's written in the last 20 years. Now, call him a social Darwinian? I don't think it's appropriate language. Call him an evolutionary ethicist, and I think that is perfectly so. So, that I see as the normative or substantive ethics of the evolutionary ethicist. And as I think, and I leave it now, I think that what's so important is what Ron said, is it isn't just one position, it covers a whole spectrum. And one starts to ask, indeed, to what extent this is evolutionary and to what extent people have in fact made up their minds before they come into it and then slap evolution onto it to make it look legitimate. What about the meta-ethics? What about the meta-ethics? And I think that, and I would say this unambiguously, yes, traditional evolutionary ethics does have a meta-ethics. And it is based completely on the notion of evolutionary progress. You heard I wrote a book, Monad to Man, blob to human, if you like, worm to woman. But it's absolutely and completely based on the idea that evolution is not a long, slow process going nowhere, but that it has, give or take, a direction. It goes from the simple to the complex, from the worthless to the full of worth, from the blob to the human. And I'm showing you a picture that was drawn by Ernst Haeckel in the second half of the 19th century. Now, not talking about Haeckel's substantive ethics or anything like that right now. I'm talking about the meta-ethics, and I'm saying it's absolutely fundamental to traditional evolutionary ethics that evolution is progressive. And this gives you the meaning, you see. Why should you preserve the rainforests? Because if you don't, humans will go, and then the highest point of evolution will wither away and even decline. And you see an awful lot of worry about decline. So you can build this in. I mean, people like H.G. Wells and The Time Machine are worrying about these things. But as I say, this is the meta-ethic, that one ought to promote evolution because it's progressive. And if you don't, then you're going to get degeneration. And this is why it is very much appropriate to introduce Spencer into this discussion, because nobody was a more ardent progressionist when it came to evolution than Herbert Spencer. So here, in fact, here is a point I would disagree with Ron, is I do think that Spencer's progressionism has, in fact, been deeply influential on people's thinking about evolution and the way that it works. I mean, for instance, Ed Wilson. I mean, the first time I met him, I went to his lab, and there on the wall was a picture of Herbert Spencer. And I said, Ed, Herbert Spencer? And he said, great man, Mike, great man. So I would argue, in fact, that Spencer has had an effect, but it's not necessarily the laissez-faire, nature read in tooth and claw effect that an awful lot of people want to attribute to him. Another person who was, in the 20th century, probably other than Wilson, nobody was a more ardent evolutionary ethicist than Julian Huxley, the grandson of Thomas Henry Huxley, the older brother of Aldous Huxley. And he wrote a book called Religion Without Revelation. He argues at the substantive level that we ought to be big science. This is the 1930s, remember, folks. The big science is the secret. He writes a book on the Tennessee Valley Authority, for instance. He's so impressed with what one can do with science and technology. And how does one justify it? Again and again and again, it is progress, it is progress, it is progress. And Wilson, too. It is absolutely fascinating to go back, what is it now, 35 years later, after Wilson wrote the big book, Sociobiology, The New Synthesis. Now, those of us who are old enough in this room will remember that when that book came out, it was highly controversial, and a lot of people of the left condemned it very strongly as racist, as it wasn't homophobic, but it was certainly capitalist, it was sexist. In America, Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Lewontin. In England, Hillary and Stephen Ruse were people who led the fight against this book. Go back and reread it. Read it for the first time. There's some there, but that's not what's motivating Ed Wilson in that book. It's not what's driving Ed. In fact, don't forget, Ed comes from the South. If anybody has got over racial prejudice in his lifetime, it's Edward O. Wilson. But what is driving him? It's progress. All through the book, the backbone of the book. And he says the great paradox is how have humans reversed the downward trend of social evolution and achieved the pinnacle? I mean, this is his language. Read the book and see how progress is so completely fundamental to Ed's vision of the organic world. As I say, I think it's a very peculiar book, but it's not peculiar in the way that I think it was read in the 1970s. Well, what's wrong with it? What's wrong with this? Well, of course, as Thomas Henry Huxley pointed out, it's not necessarily the case that evolution is that progressive. That an awful lot of stuff which has been produced by evolution is really pretty unpleasant. And one would not in any sense want to say that this is necessarily something which is good. The tiger tears someone apart because this is a good adaptation, but does one want to say that this is a morally good thing? And in Huxley's great essay, Evolution and Ethics, which he gave in 1893, the Romanes lecture, and published, I think, the year after, he says this. He says, in fact, it seems to me that ethics is often going against our biology rather than for it. Very interesting. Huxley, such a powerful and important man. Interesting, Ron said how everybody worships Spencer. He goes to America and woomph, they're not so keen on him when they meet him and hear his ideas. When Huxley gave that paper, or that essay, Evolution and Ethics, which I think today we would judge his finest essay, people thought the old man had lost it. They really, truly said, boy, poor old Huxley, he's losing his marbles, isn't he? I mean, he really isn't there. But as I say, I think Huxley puts his finger on it, that the meta-ethics of traditional evolutionary ethics, I think, is built on sand. I don't think that evolution is progressive. And then, of course, there are the philosophers, and I think particularly the great David Hume, certainly the greatest of the English-speaking philosophers, who a couple of centuries earlier had put his finger on it and pointed out that attempts to derive value from the world just aren't on, that you cannot get an is from an ought. I mean, G. Moore at the beginning of the 20th century gave his version known as the naturalistic fallacy, where he wanted to argue that goodness could not be a natural property and therefore had to be a non-natural property. But as I say, I think Hume was there before that. You cannot derive an ought from an is. That we cannot get that which we should do from the way that the world is. So that's my take on traditional evolutionary ethics. I think on the one hand, I back up what Numbers said this afternoon very strongly, that it's a lot more complex, a lot more interesting, and in many respects, I would say a lot more praiseworthy than often its reputation is taken to be. But on the other hand, personally, I want to say that it's built on a flaw, that the meta-ethical foundation, which is there's no question that that is the meta-ethical foundation. I want to argue that the meta-ethical foundation is flawed and that it just doesn't work. So now the question comes, what do we do next? Do we give up and go home? Do we, with a happy group like this, do we head for the bar and buy the speaker a drink? Or do we at least try again? Certainly, when I started doing philosophy in 1960, we gave up and went to the bar. There was no question about it. When I was an undergraduate doing philosophy, I mean, it was the standard thing. Evolutionary ethics is the one thing that we little junior philosophers knew didn't work. that it was the one way that you were going to get a good mark on your paper is evolutionary ethics, Herbert Spencer, naturalistic fallacy, move on to more important questions, like library books and that sort of thing. In fact, evolutionary ethics wasn't just wrong. It was like farting at a vicarage tea party. Not that I've been to a vicarage tea party recently, but Mike assures me that would not be a good thing to do. What I mean by that is it's not just wrong, but it's somehow unclean. It's vulgar. And there was no question that evolutionary ethics was regarded in that kind of light around about 1960. It was, we'd say, well, of course, those scientists, the favorite phrase is they've got a bit of a tin ear for philosophy. Well, some of them do have, but there's no question. But certainly, that was the attitude that we've had about evolutionary ethics around then. And I think we've had a complete sea change. Now, not everybody agrees with the position I'm taking, but at least I've got to the point where students are told about my position and warned against it. And I feel that that's a considerable progress. I think you can have progress in philosophy, particularly when I'm doing it, even if you can't have progress in evolution. But certainly, I think we've had a complete sea change. And I want to say, having criticized Ed Wilson, I think probably above all others, Ed Wilson is the person who deserves maximum praise and credit for this, because I think philosophically he was wrong, but somehow I think his intuitions were right. I think his intuition was the following, is that if we are in fact the product of a long, slow process of natural selection, rather than the miraculous product of a good God on the sixth day, then by God, by Darwin, that ought to matter. And that ought to matter with respect to the most important things, epistemology, what do I know, and ethics, what should I do? And I think Ed always had that deep intuition that it had to matter. And I think he was right. And so I want to talk now about why I think he was right, although, as I've said, I don't think his way of doing it is right. I would like to think that what I'm going to suggest now is very much in the tradition of Darwin, although obviously we've got 100 more years beyond Darwin. Now, let me start by talking more at the naturalistic level. How does morality come about? What is the modern thinking about morality? And then we can switch into the philosophical questions, which, as I say, Darwin doesn't really tackle, and ask about those. As I say, I think Wilson is right. I think Wilson is right in the sense that somehow evolution has to matter. And why is he right? Why does he have this intuition? Because obviously, as a scientist, Wilson is right at the forefront of Darwinian biologists who are saying it's not just what you are that counts, it's what you do that counts as well. Now, certainly, this is in Darwin, and I don't think anybody denied this. But for many years, I think evolutionists, Darwinians, tended to focus on physical features, the colours of butterfly wings, for instance, or the markings on snails, or things of this nature. Why? Because these are easier to quantify. These are things you can kill and take into the lab or take and look at. You can count them and all of these sorts of things. Behavior is far more difficult to deal with, and particularly, of course, as we know, if we want to do things in the lab, often organisms do the very opposite to what they will do in the wild. I mean, zookeepers know this, that some species of organism are completely fertile and breed like rabbits in the wild. But you put them into zoos, and they're a bit like philosophers. They're not interested in sex, or at least that's what my good friend Robert Pennock tells me anyhow. He says, the trouble with you, Mike, is you're not a real philosopher. Now you should look at me. So as I say, I think the key has to be Darwinism, Darwinian selection, but applied at the social level. And particularly, people like Wilson and others, Hamilton, even Richard Dawkins, say the key notion that we're dealing with when we're dealing with social behavior is the notion of altruism. I mean, there's lots of behavior which is not altruistic. I mean, as I say, the lion going after the antelope or something like that. That's behavior. It's important behavior, but it's not particularly altruistic. But what's important and what's interesting is altruistic behavior, where organisms give to others, even at their own cost, particularly at the cost of their own reproduction. And as I say, this is where one gets into the individual group selection debate in a big way. Now, the thing that Darwin emphasized, and the thing that Wilson emphasizes then, is that certainly cooperation, working together, as I say, what biologists call altruism, certainly exists and is pervasive in the animal world. We see it perhaps most obviously with the social insects. We're looking now at the Hymenoptera, not just the Hymenoptera, but the termites and others like that. But we know that altruism is something which goes beyond just the insects. For instance, we see people like Jane Goodall and others who've studied the primates have seen a great deal of altruism there. Of course, what people like Goodall have seen is many other things. And they've seen, for instance, one of the things that Goodall has seen is the incredible amount of violence that you get with chimpanzees. I mean, she's absolutely fascinating. If you read her big book, she says, for the first 2 or 3 years, you don't see it. And then you start to get the full picture, and you see how much violence there is, but also a terrific amount of altruism of mothers with offspring, with aunts helping offspring, with the dominant males in the group often tolerating and letting the young do things that they wouldn't let other adults do. All these very complex social interactions that one gets. And the point that Wilson wants to make, and others want to make, is that one sees this and Darwin wanted to make, is that one sees this in humans. Of course, we know the terrible violence of the last century and centuries before. We know that we're certainly not purely altruistic. But I think that if you were to ask any Darwinian biologist today, they would say, if you asked about humans, I mean, they're going to talk about things like intelligence. But the sorts of things they're going to say pretty much immediately is, in order to understand humans, you must understand what a social group we are. You must understand that we succeed because we are a social animal. That we do not have, for instance, we're not that fast, we're not that strong. We don't have the killer fangs and all of these sorts of things. But that we do work incredibly well socially. We have all sorts of hormonal things which keep us, tamped down. Imagine if we were chimpanzees or dogs. Well, all the alpha males in the room would be dashing around sniffing the bottoms of the females. I mean, this is the way. This is the way that dogs. This is the way, certainly, that bonobos work. I mean, this is what goes on amongst them. And yet we've got all of these various hormonal levels which quieten us down, and you spend your evening listening to me rather than sniffing. Am I living up to your expectations, Ron?
Down.
He pays me extra if I do it. So what I want to say is altruism is widespread in the animal world. However, altruism, and particularly the proximate causes of altruism, we know the ultimate causes. Ultimate causes are survival and reproduction. What about the proximate causes, to use Aristotelian distinctions? And it's pretty clear that the proximate causes are not all the same. That when you're dealing with something like the ants, they can be, to use the term which has come into being, they can be genetically determined in the sense that basically they're like little they're like little automata controlled by the genes. The genes tell them what to do, and they do it. And they are genetically determined to do what they do. And there are very good reasons for this, because you don't have to waste time on education. You can, the ant grows up and, if you like, knows what to do without any trouble, just like that. I mean, so in a way, it's a very good thing to have. The question which evolutionary biologists would ask is, well, what about humans? Are we genetically determined? For some reason, genetic determination always seems to be somebody like the man in the grey flannel suit who's a marionette being controlled by the DNA. Are we completely genetically determined? The question that in certain respects, obviously, we are. We're driven by our genes. And we do things according to, if you like, the dictates of the genes. But what is absolutely fundamental to modern evolutionary biology, modern Darwinian evolutionary biology, is that we cannot be hardline genetically determined in the way that the ants are. And there are very good reasons why this is not possible. Why can't we be genetically determined? Because we don't have as many offspring. We've taken the different reproductive strategy, if you like the language we take, we're K-selectionist rather than R-selectionist. Ants have many offspring. And it's great. They work and they work just fine. But then if something goes wrong, then 1,000, 2,000 ants can be wiped out on the spot. I mean, again, to talk about Wilson, one of his favorite parlor tricks when he had kept his lab going is he had a great big colony of leafcutter ants in his lab. And the leafcutter ant, what it does is it goes out foraging. It finds a leaf. The foragers find a leaf. They then go back to the nest, and the cutters come out. And then the cutters will cut up the leaf, carry it home, and then they pass it on to the gardeners who chew it up, grow a fungus, and then the fungus is passed on to the nursery workers who raise the young on the fungus. And then there are others who are looking after the queen. It's all beautiful. And now says Ed, wonderful, isn't it? Now he says, put a leaf in, and you see how quickly it's eaten. Now you put another leaf in, and you've suddenly got this line of ants going back and forth, cutting it up. He says, wet your finger and be very quick because the soldiers will hurt if they catch you. And rub your finger across the line that they're moving on. And what happens is, of course, the ants are following a pheromone trail. They're not thinking about what they're doing. They're chemically, determined to do what's doing. And, of course, once you break that trail, they start to mill up and down there rather than go back home. Well, now, the thing is, we don't have 2,000 or 3,000 ants, rather offspring, to lose every time it rains and the pheromone trail is lost. Although it's a rather nice thought, I must say. How many kids have you got, Mike? Well, I've got 3. Now, let's think about it. A couple of them went to McDonald's and it's just been raining. Better say 1. So in other words, we have got to be not outside causal determinism. We're not talking about we're not talking that issue now. We're talking about genetic determinism. We have got to have a flexibility which enables us to deal with different situations, and particularly, of course, different social situations. And what I want to suggest, and I'm not particularly original in this, I think this is Darwin's position and many others, is that this is where morality comes in. Morality is a way of making us social. In other words, morality is something which makes us biologically altruistic. I don't think the ant is a moral being. The ant does not follow the categorical imperative. I'm quite comfortable, unlike people like Mary Midgley, with biologists appropriating words and using them metaphorically. I've got no problem with that. But recognize that when a biologist says that an ant is altruistic, they do not mean that it is a moral being. They mean that it is doing things at its own reproductive expense. And that's the way they work, and that, I think, is the way that we work. But how do we do it? And I would want to say that we are literally moral, that we are genetically determined to think in certain ways about helping others, and that this then, as mediated through culture, and notice I'm not mentioning culture, but I think that's tremendously important too. I think that this is the way that we are mediated to become biologically altruistic. So in other words, what I'd want to say is, should I kill somebody is not something that I debate. The question is, am I going to do it? Am I going to follow what I should do? I think is often something that we do debate. I think only, the French existentialists at their most ridiculous, have suggested that we actually really genuinely make up morality. I think morality is something which is laid on us, but it's not, and I think it's something which is laid on us by our biology, but how we interact, I think, is another matter. As I say, lots of qualifications about culture go in there. So and this comes to the end of my sort of naturalistic account of morality, then what then am I talking about? What kind of, as it were, what kind of genetically determined moral system do we have that we apply in the different situations? Well, I think it's basically common sense morality. Help others, look after others, particularly, and anybody who's had kids knows that one of the greatest moral issues is being fair. That anybody who's raised children knows full well that there is nothing that causes more disputes amongst children than the sense that either that you're favouring one child over another. Humans, and generally, anybody who's had students knows this. It's one thing to give them all a C, but if you find that, you're giving the pretty girls A's and the guys all C's, then that's another matter altogether. It's just not fair. And, of course, the most famous second half of the 20th century American philosophical position, which was articulated by John Rawls, is very much one which is predicated on fairness. Rawls says that what we should do is be just, and what is justness? It is fairness. Now, the question is how you work this out. But as I say, the point I'm trying to make here is I don't think that evolutionary ethics is going to give you a whole new ethics. I'm not looking for that. I'm always worried about anybody who's got a whole new system, because either they're wrong or it's in Plato. And I don't think that one should be looking for that. I think the question is, can one understand the sorts of things that moral philosophers think important in Darwinian terms? And I want to say that one could. So that's the naturalistic case. But now, as we draw on to the sort of final part, or almost the final part of the story, what about the philosophy? Where does the philosophy come in here? What about what should I do? And why should I do what I should do? Well, I want to argue, and I would certainly argue very much, is that, in fact, I think that there is no higher appeal to what we should do than what we think we should do. In other words, I'm a naturalist at this level. I'm not talking about justification now, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. But what should I do? Well, if you like, do what comes naturally. Do what you think that you should do. I'm not going to argue that, something else. That doesn't mean to say that there's no place for moral discussion, because don't forget, an awful lot of moral decisions are not made just on the basis of morality, but they're also based on what we know about the facts. Should I plunge a knife into somebody's heart? Well, no, if I'm a murderer. But yes, if I've got the skills as a surgeon and this person needs a valve transplant or valve repair or something like that, the facts are always changing what the moral case is. So note, I'm not saying that there's no place for moral discussion. I would say that, nevertheless, evolutionary theory can be helpful in helping us to articulate what we really believe. Now, that sounds a little bit like a social worker, but I think there's a certain truth to this. People are inclined to say things, well, I think you should love everybody, or something like that. And I think, in fact, if you start to look at this evolutionary theory, you'd start to say, well, I'm not sure that evolutionary theory would imply this. Do we really think that this would be the case? One thing which, for instance, it seems to me would be the case is that evolutionary theory would suggest we're going to have stronger moral sentiments to our own relatives, and particularly to our closer relatives than to our more distant relatives, and then perhaps to those in our social circle, and then, only then, to the people in the Sudan or something like that. Now, you might say, well, boy, we knew you were social Darwinian at heart. But I think there's a certain truth to this. I call it the bleak house problem. And because Dickens, one doesn't much care for Dickens, it turns out, but in Bleak House, Dickens is savage about people who spend all their time worrying about the heathen in Africa and ignore their own families. And this is a picture where the young woman who's the heroine is discussing this with the daughter who's neglected. And what Dickens says is, charity begins at home. And I think that basically a lot of us feel this way. If somebody said to me, "Oh, Robert Pennock, I'm sorry to keep picking on you, Robert, let's take Ed Larson, shall we? Wake him up. Ed?" Ed. Let's take Ed Larson. Now, if somebody said, if Ron said to me, Ed Larson, he's a wonderful human being. He's a better person than we are. And I say, well, why is that? He gives 3/4 of his salary to the Salvation Army. He gives 3/4 of his salary. As soon as it comes in, he gives 3. I say, the guy lives in California, he can afford to do that. Oh, yes, he does that. Well, what about his wife and kids? Well, it's a bit hard on the wife and kids. They haven't had meat in 10 years, and they have to go actually to Goodwill to get their clothing. I'm not going to say Ed Larson's a fine human being. I'm going to say, the word which comes to mind is asshole, but I couldn't use it in this company. But what I'm saying is, I don't think that necessarily when you start to think about these things, that evolutionary theory is really quite so off the wall and counterintuitive as one might think initially. And in fact, my hero David Hume discusses this very matter. He says that our sentiments follow our relationships. And of course, something else which philosophers have discussed, a kind of problem that philosophers love to discuss. You're down a mine, and there's 5 people, on one track, and there's 1 person on another track, and there's a trolley of coal coming down, and you're by a switch, and it's going to go and kill the 5 people, but if you flick the switch, and it's only going to kill the 1 person, would you do it? And 90% of people say, well, yes, I would. Then the second example is formally exactly the same, but there's no switch. And it's somebody that you're standing next to who's rather fat and heavy. It can't be you, because it's not a question of self-sacrifice. You're a skinny little runt like Jeff Slosh, for instance. So Jeff throwing himself in front of the trolley wouldn't make any difference. But it's got to be somebody fairly substantial. Would you shove them and kill them and save the 5 people? And most people say no. And of course, there seems to be a formal similarity, except people disagree. And of course, the answer that evolutionists give is, well, because when we're dealing with people on a one-on-one basis, often we feel very differently than if we're thinking about people, in just in theory or this sort of thing. And this, of course, is one of the reasons why, for instance, Save the Children's Fund don't just give you, save the children. What they will do is show you pictures of children suffering in the Sudan. In other words, they're trying to make the personal contact, because in doing that, we're animals. I mean, I don't mean that in a bad sense. We're animals who respond to these things in an evolutionary way. So as I say, I think that one can get a lot more sophisticated than just, be fair or love your neighbor as yourself. I don't think that evolutionary theory is necessarily just that crude. But basically what I want to say is, at the normative level, I don't think there's any more than you can say than go with your feelings or go with what feels right. Except if you're a sociologist, and you should never go with what you think is right then. But there we are. One of my children. What about the meta-ethics? What about the meta-ethics? What about the justification? Now, there are some people who've plunged into evolutionary ethics of the kind I'm talking about, who think that there's no need to answer this question. That they feel that basically, once you've said the way it is, that's all there is to be said. And I've just been reading, in fact, a book which, what is it called? Not Brainstorm, but something like that, which has just been published by Patricia Churchland. And she discusses these sorts of things. She wants to give a completely evolutionary perspective. And perhaps I've got, that's it, Brain Trust. It's just been published. So I don't know whether it's out over here, but it's just been published in America. Got quite a bit of publicity. And basically, she's giving the kind of account that I've been giving. I mean, she talks more about the brain than I do, than about evolutionary biology. But basically, we're completely on the same path here. But what about the justification? And what Patricia says is, I don't think you have to answer that question. And what she says is, I don't think the naturalistic fallacy or the is-ought distinction, it holds water. I just don't think that that's particularly important. Morality seems to be a natural phenomenon, constrained by the forces of natural selection, rooted in neurobiology, shaped by the local economy, modified by cultural developments. I mean, a statement that I would subscribe to completely and utterly. But as far as she's concerned, that's it. There's no need to do any more work because metaethics is, if you like, it's not a real issue. There's no more. And I want to disagree with this. I really want to say that I think the naturalistic fallacy or the is-ought distinction exists and is important. I think that Hume was absolutely right. I think there is a fundamental difference between saying, I like to make a lot of money, therefore I should go out of my way just to make money. I would like to have sex with my colleague's wife, therefore it's okay to do it. I think that there's a complete difference between the is and the ought. I like to do these things, I should, or it's okay for me to do them, or it's not okay for me to do them. I want to argue are not only different claims, but I want to agree with Hume and with Moore, that I think they're claims of a different logical type. I want to suggest that morality is a very clever invention by the genes. Because I want to say that morality is something which gets us above being the animal. And this is the point that T.H. Huxley made. That morality which is something which lifts us above our emotions. What is it? There's a statement to this effect, as I just remember, in African Queen, where Humphrey Bogart says, well, it's natural. And Catherine Hepburn says that, doing right is, we're put on this earth not to do what is natural, but to do what is right. And I want to argue that there is a fundamental difference. And I think the clever thing about the genes is that what they've done is made us social by, as it were, getting us above. Bugger it. I don't have to bother about this paper. I'll just give them an A. It's the easy way out. And no, that's not. It wouldn't be fair to me, to the student, to the other students, if I just did it that way. And I think that morality is something which lifts us out of ourselves to make us moral and moral beings in order to be social beings. So in other words, I'm not making morality something preachy or something like that. I think it's biological, but I think it's different biological from other sorts of desires. So what about the foundations? And I want to argue that maybe there are no foundations, that ultimately morality is something which is put in play by the genes to make us social, but maybe there isn't any ultimate foundation like, non-natural properties or the progressiveness of evolution or God's will or something like that. It's a funny kind of emotion that we've got. But notice, the important thing about I would want to say about the emotion of morality is that we don't think that it's subjective. In the words of John Mackey, and none of this is original, it's all been written about by philosophers, but John Mackey made the very important point that somehow, it's an ugly word, but I think it's a good word, we objectify. We not only use moral claims, but we think that they are objective. It's one thing to say, I don't like spinach, Ed likes spinach, so be it. But it's another thing if I, for instance, find out that, Ed, let's not pick on Ed, it's time to pick on Jeff again. If I find out that, Jeff is giving marks to students, for favours given or whatever, something like that, what I'm going to say is, what is that? Okay. What I'm going to say is, not only you shouldn't do it, and then Jeff's going to say, well, why not? Nobody's going to find out. Who the hell? they're happy, I'm happy, what the hell? What I'm going to say, and of course it sounds preachy, but I think we all do this. We want to say, yes, Jeff, but I'm not asking you about how you feel. I'm not asking you about how I feel. I'm asking you about what is right. It's bigger than the two of us. Now, what does bigger than the two of us mean? I know what it means, Whether it has any referent, of course, is another matter. It's like when you're teaching morality to kids. They say, why? And finally, if you don't say, well, of course, if you don't do it, I'll beat the shit out of you, you say, because, ultimately, that's what's right. And there is no more argument about this. This is, you get to the point where it's just right. So I want to say that morality is an illusion put in place by the genes, but that what makes it work is that we objectify. So does this mean, now that I've told you about this, does this mean that you're now free to say, oh, well, Mike Ruse has shown us that morality is an illusion of the genes, and so we can go out and rape and pillage anybody for a good night out at Oxford? No, because I think I like to use what I call the Raskolnikov problem. Is, of course, Dostoevsky wrestles with this issue. And he said, the Raskolnikov thinks he can kill the old woman. And the detective knows that he's done it. But he doesn't arrest him. He waits until his conscience gets to him. The point is, I've evolved, you've evolved, and that sort of thing. So you say, well, let's go and do this, that, and the other. And I know that I would feel awful if I did it. I mean, I really would feel awful. It doesn't mean to say I never do. I'm not saying that we're always moral. Understand that. My position is not that we're always moral, but my position is we always have that sense of morality hanging over us, if you like, or something of this nature, and I think it works very effectively. So I'm not too bothered about telling you folks the way that things really are, because I think that, I don't think the truth sets you free. I mean, I think, God, what a thing to say, but I really truly don't think that it's like somebody who's been lying on the couch for months, and finally you say, and so now you realize your mother doesn't hate you. And they say, yes, that's terrific. And they say, well, what are you going to do now? And you say, well, I'm just going to go home and write a nasty letter to my mother. The truth does not set you free. So that's why I think Darwin is relevant to ethics. But as I say, this is tremendously important to me, is I don't want a Darwinian analysis of ethics just like that. I think it has to be one which is backed up by good philosophy. And that's why I like to say my position is a Darwinian position, but it's David Hume's position brought up to date by Charles Darwin. And I think that Darwin himself would feel pretty comfortable with the sorts of things that I'm saying. Finally, since we are here, and since it is the Ian Ramsey Centre and that sort of thing, what about religion? What about religion? How does this fit in? Am I at one with the new atheists on this? Well, at one level, speaking personally, I certainly am. Ron laughed a bit about my beliefs, and he's right. I mean, I describe myself as an agnostic, but basically I'm pretty atheistic about Christianity, although I do like to describe myself as a very conservative non-believer. I feel very strongly that process theology is an abomination to the Lord. So don't try and get me on that one. Okay. But what I do want to say is the following, is I think that I've offered a position which is perfectly adequate. I think this is a position you can take and go home with, and you don't need any more. But what about somebody who is religious? Am I offering this as a position which is counter to religion? In other words, am I doing a Sam Harris here and saying, take this, and now you see that Christianity is false? And I don't think that this is necessarily so at all, because notice that my whole position that I've offered tonight has gone in with the metaphysical assumption that I don't need God to do this work. In other words, I may not be, whether or not I'm a metaphysical naturalist, I'm a methodological naturalist, and I don't think I've said anything tonight about metaphysical naturalism. In other words, what my position has been, keep God out of this discussion. But my position has not necessarily been, but there is no God or anything like that. What about somebody who is religious? And this is the kind, as I say, although I'm a non-believer, I'm very happy to offer you Christians some help. What about somebody who is a believer? What do you say in the light of a position like mine? Oh, Ruse says that, that ethics or morality is an illusion fobbed off on us by the genes. Let's get that down and use that in our next next thing from the Discovery Institute. Now, that happens, incidentally. I get people phoning me and saying, we just want to make sure, Professor Ruse, that you actually said this. And I say, quite happily, thank you very much. The phone goes down, and then a week later, the Discovery Institute or somebody, there it is. Atheist Ruse says. I don't think that my position necessarily precludes a Christian embracing it at some level. Now, it's got to be a Christian who's going to take naturalism seriously. In other words, I think this rules out Alvin Plantinga. But I don't think it rules out, as I say, a theologian or a Christian who takes a naturalistic position seriously. And in particular, of course, I've got one theologian very much in mind here, and that, of course, is Thomas Aquinas, whose thinking is very much predicated on Aristotle's thinking, and no greater naturalist than Aristotle. And I would want to argue that the kind of position that I've taken, if somebody subscribed to some kind of natural law position, my position could be fitted in very nicely within that kind of overall framework. So how might a Christian move forward? Search for a Christian position, as I say, that is naturalistic. I think that Aquinas would be a good place to start. I'm not saying he's the only place, but I think that this would be a good place. Now, what was Aquinas' ethics, and particularly what was his meta-ethics? Natural law theory, eternal law, the rational guidance of created things on the part of God, we can call the eternal law. Natural law is this participation in the eternal law by rational creatures is called natural law. It seems to me the kind of position I've been sketching this evening is something that could be, if you feel the need to, could be put in this overall metaphysical context pretty readily. Now, notice that that doesn't mean to say we're necessarily, therefore, going to be frozen back at the time of Aristotle, or at the time of Aquinas, rather. It does not mean that there's no place for debate. It does not mean, for instance, that suddenly I'm arguing that all abortion is wrong, that gay marriage is immoral, and all of the sorts of things that the Catholic bishops seem to be pushing at the moment. I'm arguing for a natural law position, for a position within the Thomistic framework, not necessarily for Thomas's own position or for the position that many Catholics participate today. As I say, I think the Darwinian can feel comfortable with this, but it still leaves open issues like what is natural and things like homosexuality, birth control, abortion, and these things. And I think that this is a place where the natural comes into play because we now know, thanks to evolutionary biology, a great deal more about things like sexual orientation and how it works and why it might in fact be very natural to have gays around us and that sort of thing. And certainly when you come to things like birth control, of course, on the one hand, we're doing a lot of very unnatural things. As Ron pointed out this afternoon, we're introducing all sorts of modern medicine which mean that people don't get killed or don't die young. So instead of having 2 or 3 kids, suddenly people have got, as the Darwins and others started to have 6, 7, 8, 9, and so on and so forth. So as I say, I think there's lots of debate about, if you alter things at one level, what you should do at another level and all of these things. So as I say, I don't think this closes the discussion. I think, in fact, it starts the discussion. So that's my position. Darwin, as it were, helping Humean thinking to come up to date, and if you want to, I think it's possible to fit it into some, as I like to say, you notice I'm a pretty conservative non-believer. I'm not suggesting a Whiteheadian approach to this, and this is a bit of a joke, but I've lived with people like Phil Hefner and others for a long, long time, and they think the only way that you're going to bring evolutionary theory and Christianity together is by, I would say, tampering pretty dramatic ways with Christian thinking. Or you're going to have to tamper in pretty dramatic ways with evolutionary thinking. And this recent book by Conor O'Connor, or whatever it's called, what's that book called? I just reviewed it. An eminently forgettable title. Darwin's... Yeah, that's the one, yeah. I think he sells out. So notice what I'm trying to do is I want to have both of them, if you want to have both of them. I want to have very orthodox Darwinism. I want to have very orthodox, not in the Greek Orthodox, but very conservative Christianity. And if you can't stay with both of those, don't try. Thanks.
Okay, I know many of you would like to go off to the pub now, but that would be wrong. We have to take 10 minutes for discussion here first. And so the microphone is in the back. The first person whose hand I saw is over in the left and then right behind you. Why don't you just reverse the order?
Yeah, can we start here?
I have a question about your quotation from Ed Wilson, which I think you quote approvingly, where Wilson says that evolution is progressive, and progressive progressive implies movement towards some goal. So, in other words, evolution is teleological. And I have two questions. First of all, what's the end game? What are we moving toward here? What is the end game? If it's teleological, we're moving towards some point.
Well, I think Wilson is human beings.
But we're already there, then. The end of history has arrived.
Well, all I'm saying is, I noticed, remember, I don't subscribe to evolutionary progression. What I'm trying to say is what I think that people who push traditional evolutionary ethics subscribe to. And I want to argue that if you look at somebody like Spencer, look at Julian Huxley, you look at Ed Wilson, they are all progressionists in the sense that they think evolution starts with the simple and ends with human beings. So that, I think, is... you might have a different definition, but what I'm trying to do is characterize what I think their understanding of progress is.
Okay, and the second part of my question fits with that. If not in your own opinion, can you tell us what they see as being the driver behind this teleology?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it varies. In the case of Spencer is not a Darwinian. Spencer is a Lamarckian. He believes in some kind, what happens, he calls it dynamic equilibrium, that things get sort of disturbed, and then, as it were, as they reorganize themselves, you get a jump up through sort of Lamarckian processes, and you achieve another level of equilibrium. And Spencer is quite clear that he does not regard natural selection as a significant player. Now, Julian Huxley was, of course, a Darwinian, and in many respects a very ardent one. However, and I'm not the only one to say this, if you look at Huxley, there's an awful lot of assumption that it's going to happen. And people pointed out that Huxley was deeply influenced by Henri Bergson, the French vitalist. And I remember Huxley's son saying this. He said, my dad was always a vitalist. He realized he couldn't bring it explicitly into his science, but it was always there. So I think in the case of somebody like Julian Huxley, he really thought that there was some kind of life force driving things up. Ed Wilson, I think Ed thinks that you can get out of natural selection with a dog. I think he's a Darwinian Spencerian. I think he thinks in a kind of Spencerian overall picture, but I think he thinks that natural selection is very important there. But he does not think that individual selection is the key player. I think increasingly he thinks that it's some kind of group selection which does.
Back in the far corner there.
Thank you. Actually, I had a question in the same vein as the last one. It's about the the beliefs of the 19th century progressive evolutionists. This concept of progress implies a target on the wall, but the predominant cosmology of the 19th century had the universe being eternal, no beginning and no end, which implies that there isn't any wall for there to be a target on. Did this bother anyone at the time? Was this a contradiction in their overall scientific picture that anyone speculated about?
That's a good question, because it is. And people pointed this out to Spencer. And basically Spencer said, don't worry, don't bother my mind with facts, which Spencer was rather inclined. Thomas Henry Huxley said, Spencer's idea of a tragedy is a beautiful hypothesis destroyed by facts. say that progress is going to happen. But I think that's basically how Spencer worked it. He basically ignored it, or put it on one side.
Can I be really mean and ask you to go back behind the lectern? Can I ask you to go back behind the
Well, I
lectern?
can't hear it.
You can't hear it? Okay, fair enough.
I will try.
Sorry.
Anyhow, I feel much more like Oprah, and if I can move around, I feel, I watch a lot of daytime television. If I can't, emote and connect with my audience, I just don't feel I'm doing my job.
I'm much younger. I can hear and translate for you.
yeah. The trouble is, you're putting negations in front of every main verb. Okay,
You skipped from ants to higher primates, but there are higher animals which are more complicated in the sense that they seem to have inherited behavior and behavior that they learn from their parents. Kittens do some things instinctively, others they learn from their mother, who learnt it from her mother, and so on. So shouldn't the learned behavior of birds and animals be folded into any discussion of this kind?
Well, my dear chap, it's 9:30. I'm more than happy to start again and to fold in birds and others. Of course it should be. I mean, you're quite right, absolutely. But surely isn't the case that ethologists and primatologists and others are suggesting that morality, Frans de Waal, for instance, would be a case in point, are suggesting that morality is not, just a human ability, that if you want to call it proto-morality or something like that, that this exists. I mean, Naomi works at the Konrad Lorenz Institute, so, it's pretty much gospel there. So the answer to your question is yes. What I think is interesting but notice that there isn't going to be just a simple chain of being going up simply like that. You're going to get more altruism or more proto-morality amongst those organisms who've gone the social way and who need it more. So, for instance, I think you might find more morality amongst, I find it quite plausible to say you're going to find more morality amongst wolves than you are amongst gorillas. Why would that be? I mean, that's just a possible example, but why would that be? Because wolves have gone the social way in a way that certainly orangutans have not. I mean, orangutans are deeply asocial, for instance. So, I don't expect to find a proto-Kantian amongst the orangutans. But dogs, look, I'm an Englishman. I know that dogs, are proto-Kantians. I've got a couple myself. So, I don't think there's any question that dogs can show emotions like shame. And things. I mean, of course they can. And love and affection and that sort of thing. So, yes, if this is, I think, the drive of your question, I expect to find all of these things in the animal world. But as I say, I think you've got to be very careful not to assume that the bonobos are always going to be the best indicator of how humans behave.
This will have to be the last question this evening.
Okay, first I want to thank you very much for a very fine, stimulating paper. And a paper
Right, let's finish there, shall we?
No.
I did hear that, Ron.
Okay. I just first want to comment. I've no love for Charlton Heston, which I know nothing against Charlton Heston or Cardinal Spellman or indeed Mother Teresa of Calcutta. But if in fact you're talking about a Christian, a character which reveals Christianity, I think the only one that's authoritative is in fact the word person of Jesus himself, Jesus of Nazareth. And there you have a statement that love of enemies. I just want to comment on love of enemies is something which doesn't seem naturally to fit in very easily to the Darwinian social ethics. Now maybe it does.
No, I think you've got the microphone too close to your mouth.
Sorry. Love of enemies. I'm talking about love of enemies being not something which is very easy, it doesn't accommodate itself very easily, in my opinion, to Darwinian social ethics, or evolutionary ethics. The second thing is that you talked to, this is a question which was raised here by this gentleman here, that, evolutionary ethics, in some ways, that is an invention of our genes that in some way makes us more accessible makes us more social beings because we don't possess the same reproductive qualities of ants. I can think of elephants and others that don't possess them also. And maybe they don't have the same reproductive genes. It's just two comments.
So, is there
I suppose it's comments. I would appreciate an answer, though. Please. Well, I just... Sorry.
I just couldn't understand it.
Okay, let me say it again. Morality...
Love your enemy doesn't seem to sit well with Darwin.
Well,
That was the first point.
Yes.
well, the point is, I want to say at some level it does. I mean, because notice when we talk about love your enemies, by and large, we don't mean go out and, somebody's just raped your daughter, so, offer him your other daughter. I mean, that's not loving your enemies. Loving your enemies is a much more complex sort of thing. I mean, I think a lot of people would say that certainly punishment and restraint and giving people new opportunities, not just cutting them off or something like that, I think would very much come into loving your enemies. And I don't see that any of that is precluded by Darwinism. And in fact, of course, a lot of the game theory games, tit for tat, and the sorts of things that Bill Hamilton and others were working on, were very Darwinian and very much fit into those sorts of things. So you're right. If love your enemies means being, a kind of ultra quick, where you turn the other cheek to everything. Now, I think that Darwin would say, no, my position does not subscribe to that. But by and large, I think Darwin would say, I don't consider that particularly moral. And whatever people say, what they really do is much more indicative of how they really feel. And in fact, my position fits into this. You see, the point is, a naturalistic position at some level is not trying to overturn what people believe. A naturalistic position is trying to say, here we are, we have this body of stuff which we call morality or ethics. Can we explain it? And I think that what Darwin is trying to do is offer an explanation of that. And I don't see, as I said, that what Darwin is trying to do is at all antithetical to the basic sort of positions. We got that. Notice, and if we did have more time, I haven't mentioned culture at all. And I think that's an appalling omission, because it's clearly a very fundamental part of the discussion. So please note that, if you like, chapter 2 is very much on that.
Thank you, Mike. This was a very stimulating lecture. I have only one complaint. I know no more about Thrasymachus than I did when I came here. And that was the only reason I came, was to learn about that. Please join me in thanking him. Good. Hey.